Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when applause meant survival, and perfume was replaced by the smell of blood and bronze. So dim your lights, settle into your blankets, and let's take a slow walk into the Roman Empire, where entertainment was loud, the politics were messy, and even the women occasionally decided to step into the sand of the arena and see what all the fuss was about. Now, when most people picture gladiators, they think of muscular men, sweaty, angry, wearing very little and shouting even less. But the Romans, being both practical and endlessly theatrical, eventually asked themselves a question that only they could have thought was reasonable. What if women did it too? And because Rome never found a spectacle it didn't want to make slightly more scandalous, the answer was yes. Yes, they could fight. And yes, people would pay to see it. The women who fought in the arena were called gladiatrices, a word that historians still pronounce with a small sigh, because there's so little written about them that every scrap of information feels like gossip overheard in a tavern 2,000 years ago. But those scraps tell us something fascinating. Some women, in a society that tried very hard to keep them invisible, found a way to take the stage, in the most dangerous way possible. Let's drift back, slowly, to the 1st century CE. The empire is booming, the colosseums are full, and the emperors, bored out of their minds by too much power and too little perspective, are constantly looking for new ways to surprise the crowd. The audience has already seen everything: men fighting animals, animals fighting other animals, men pretending to be mythological heroes while getting accidentally stabbed in the spleen. The public has yawned through it all. So, naturally, someone says, what if women fought? And the Senate, after pretending to be scandalized, agrees that, well, maybe just once, for cultural enrichment. And so they do. Imagine the scene: torches flickering, the sand glowing gold beneath the night fires, and two women stepping into the arena. They might be slaves, or free women seeking fame, or, very occasionally, members of the upper classes who were, as the Romans politely put it, eccentric. Their armor gleams, though it's lighter than what the men wear. Helmets sometimes left their faces visible, not for safety, but for spectacle, because the crowd wanted to see that these were women. They wanted to see beauty meet brutality. The poet Juvenal, who was basically ancient Rome's grumpy gossip columnist, couldn't resist writing about them. He was horrified, of course, because women, in his view, were supposed to spin wool and look pious, not swing swords. He wrote about noble ladies training in the gymnasium, wielding spears and sweating like men. He thought it was disgraceful, which, coming from a man who lived in a city famous for public baths and vomitoria, is saying something. But Juvenal's disgust only proves one thing: it was real. Women really did fight, and they were good enough to annoy the moralists. One of the most famous female fighters we know by name was Achilles, a woman who fought another named Amazonia. Their match was so celebrated that it was immortalized in marble relief, a smooth, elegant carving showing two women mid-fight, poised, balanced, and entirely serious about what they were doing. They weren't a novelty act. They were gladiators. Now, we should be honest, there weren't many of them. Women in the arena were rare, and usually reserved for special games designed to shock or delight the crowd. Think of it less as an equal opportunity employment program, and more as ancient Rome's version of a controversial halftime show. Still, their presence stayed something. It blurred the rigid lines of Roman gender norms in a way that both fascinated and terrified men. Because if a woman could pick up a sword and make the crowd cheer, what else could she do? Of course, that sort of question tends to make emperors nervous. So, by the time of Emperor Septimius Severus, around 200 CE, the empire decided it had had enough. Severus banned women from the games entirely, officially ending their short, strange chapter in Roman spectacle. But let's be honest, if Rome was banning something, it usually meant it had gotten a little too popular for comfort. Still, before that ban, There were enough stories to suggest that the gladiatrices had made their mark. Some were slaves trained in special schools. Some were volunteers who stepped into the arena for reasons that ranged from debt to fame to sheer boredom. In a world where women's lives were tightly controlled, the arena offered something intoxicating: freedom. A terrible, bloody kind of freedom, but freedom nonetheless. And it's worth remembering that the crowd didn't always treat them as freaks. The Romans loved courage in any form. If a woman fought bravely, she was applauded, cheered, maybe even adored. For those few moments, she wasn't someone's wife or servant or property. She was the center of the world. Now, that's not to say life as a gladiatrix was glamorous. Far from it. Training was brutal, the conditions filthy, and the odds of survival, well, let's say you wouldn't buy a long-term life insurance plan. They trained in the ludus, the gladiator school, under a lanista, who owned them and rented them out to the games. The training was strict, and the diet surprisingly vegetarian. Lots of barley, beans, and water, because nothing says ready for battle like a solid digestive system. When they weren't training, they were on display. Literally, gladiators were celebrities and property at the same time. Their portraits were painted on walls, their names carved into tiles. People placed bets on them, wrote poems about them, even sent them love letters. A successful fighter could become famous, even rich, if they lived long enough. And, like their male counterparts, some gladiatrices won their freedom through victory. Imagine that moment, a woman standing in the center of the arena, her sword raised, the crowd roaring, and the editor of the games granting her rudies, the wooden sword that meant release. It was symbolic, of course, but for a woman in the Roman world, it must have felt monumental. To earn freedom not through marriage or inheritance, but through skill and courage. But let's drift a little deeper into the strangeness of it all, because not all female combatants fought other women. Some, it seems, were pitted against dwarfs or exotic animals, a kind of grotesque comedy act that reflected the Romans' boundless creativity in missing the point. Others fought in reenactments of myths, Helen of Troy, Penthesilea, or the Amazons. Rome was obsessed with Amazons. They were the ultimate fantasy, women who fought like men but still looked like women. It was the empire's way of safely indulging in the idea of female power, so long as it stayed inside the arena and preferably ended in a tasteful amount of blood. And yet, for all the misogyny, for all the spectacle, something subversive lingered. When a woman fought and won, she became a symbol, unintentionally, perhaps, for the fact that the boundaries of power weren't as rigid as Rome liked to pretend. Let's imagine one of them. It's evening. The amphitheater glows with torchlight. The sand is darkened in patches, the crowd murmuring with anticipation. A gate creaks open. She steps out. Maybe her name is unknown to us. Maybe it's something like Lysandra or Cassie. She's wearing a short tunic, her arms bare, her hair tied up, her skin glistening with oil and dust. Across the arena, her opponent appears, another woman, her equal in strength and resolve. The trumpet sounds. They move in slow circles, the air thick with heat and noise. A feint, a lunge, the clash of metal on metal. The crowd erupts, not because it's scandalous, but because it's thrilling, because it's human, because, for that fleeting moment, no one in the stands is thinking about gender, or class, or propriety. They are just watching courage made flesh. She wins, perhaps, or maybe she falls. Either way, she's remembered, not by name, but by the ripples she leaves in history. The kind that surfaced 2,000 years later in a dusty marble relief, and makes someone like us stop and wonder, who was she? Of course, when dawn came, the empire went back to normal. The senators frowned, the poets moralized, and the women of Rome returned to their proper places, mostly indoors, mostly silent. But every now and then, in a quiet corner of the city, a child might have traced a carving on a wall, seen two women with swords, and asked, "Did that really happen?" And someone, perhaps an old veteran of the games, would have nodded slowly and said, "Yes, once," because it did. And that's the strange beauty of history. It's never as neat as we think. Even in a world built on hierarchy and control, people find ways to defy it. Sometimes with words, sometimes with rebellion, and sometimes with a well-aimed gladius. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think of those forgotten fighters. Not queens or saints or noblewomen, but something rarer. A handful of women who looked at the most terrifying stage in the world and said, "All right then." They fought. They bled. They disappeared. But for a moment, under torchlight and sand, they stood free. And that's worth remembering. Now, let's drift quietly onward, to the next imperial eccentric who decided that wasn't nearly scandalous enough.